Hello again. Uh, Welcome to Lecture 16, the last one for our course. Happy to have had you in the course. The arrival of Buddhist teachers in the seaports of China marked a significant moment in the history of the tradition. From the perspective of our continued discussion about the Great Circle of Buddhism, the maritime arrival from the 4th century onward was the final arc that completed the rim, bounding the area under the influence of the religion. Buddhist practices and thought that started in India and followed two different tracks, caravan and sea routes to East Asia, came into contact with one another. The impact of developments and transmission methods by both land and sea were most clearly outlined in China. In the capital of the Han Dynasty, the greater influence of the caravan routes was the one that historians first recorded. In this slide, we see the fragmentation of Inner Asia in the 7th century, making travel across these multiple kingdoms more and more difficult. By the 10th century, the rise of the power of steppe tribal groups further disturbed the ease of travel and communication from India to China over the caravan routes. It was over time that events in Central Asia made travel and regular trade difficult, while maritime commerce was expanding at an unprecedented level from the beginning of the Common Era. So little wonder that the influence of caravan routes that wound through thinly populated deserts and mountains could hardly match that of the maritime world, with contacts that included some of the largest cities in the world. As a result, the dominance of inland activity gave way to new maritime portals for the arrival of Buddhism. These entry points were in places such as Guangzhou in the south of China. Thus, what is called Chinese Buddhism shifted from the earliest formations in the north to newer systems of practice coming from the sea lanes to the south. The histories of Chinese Buddhism have been dominated by interpretations of the changes that were occurring among the Chinese Buddhists, often based only on the internal dynamics of the empire. There's been far more interest in what the Chinese made of Buddhism than on the developments that had taken place outside the Central Kingdom and introduced into the region. This limitation of study has often obscured the importance and the nature of practices arriving by land or sea, not originating in China. It's impossible to understand them by only using Chinese historical lens. From these outside maritime influences that merged with local practices, Chinese Buddhism by the 8th century exhibited patterns that are still felt today, such as Chan, dhyana, consciousness-only mental aspects, ascendancy of Guanyin Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva narratives tied to Amitabha Buddha, ordination of Chinese women as nuns, introduction of empowerment rituals of Tantra, especially for aiding ruling elite. In other words, study of Chinese Buddhism cannot omit the recognition of the flow of ideas and practices that came from distant sources and were introduced through major seaports. Following the sequence of time and place that we have previously seen in mainland and island Southeast Asia, we now move to East Asia. While Guangzhou became a major portal for Maritime Buddhism, it is important to look at an earlier presence of Buddhism along the East Asian coast. One of the seaports that marked the geographical beginning of the East Asian area was the Red River Basin, located in the Jiaoji provincial area that included southern China as well as Vietnamese territory. On a modern map, we can say it was Hanoi. It was here that Kang Sung Hui, son of a Sogdian sea merchant, became a master of meditation. In 247, he's said to have gone to the southern capital at Nanjing from his home city of Lulan. Previously, we've discussed the narrative regarding Buddhabhadra, who arrived by sea to the north and is the first person to be called a master of meditation in China. In the 3rd century, another Central Asian monk, Kalyana Ruchi, came to the Red River and is recorded as a translator of Buddhist texts. There is much information that supports the presence of Buddhism and its movement by sea in the 3rd century. Sea trade had been active between India and the Red River region long before the first Buddhist monks arrived. As we mentioned in the discussion, the Mekong trading node at Akeo was a link point between India and the commercial and cultural aspects of China. Archaeology provides clues to the artifacts that carry proof of this early Indian influence to the Mekong and beyond. For example, similar glass beads can be found at Arikamedu in India and at Akeo. An external report of contact comes from the account of a Roman merchant who arrived in the region in 226 of the Common Era. He came across the Malay Peninsula at the Isthmus of Kra and sailed from there to Akeo. Roman as well as Indian artifacts give us an idea of the way in which cultural and social influences move toward the Red River Basin. Now, the arrival of so-called Chan masters needs a bit of clarification. When we speak of Buddhabhadra and Kang Sung Hui as Chan masters, it is important to note that the term was used to identify the practices of certain monks who were renowned for their knowledge of yogic practice of dhyana or meditation. Now, they were not part of the lineage of the Chan movement started in the 6th century by Bodhidharma. While Bodhidharma might be viewed as just another of the flow of Chan masters who were coming by sea from the 3rd century, the school that developed around his teachings and lineage cannot be identified as the same Chan represented by Buddhabhadra or Kangsun Hui. Now, when we compare the historical narratives of the assimilation of Buddhist ideas in Chang'an, capital of the Han Dynasty, with the reports from Jiaoji in the south, there are differences. The earliest Han translators and teachers are said to have turned their attention to Taoist ideas as matches for the foreign teachings of Buddhism. This does not seem to have been the case for such promoters of Buddhism in the south as Sun Quan or Moji. Instead of trying to convince the Han people of the importance of Buddhism by reference to Taoism, they made the case that Indian ideas could be compared to Confucian values and ideas. They acknowledged that Buddhism was not mentioned in the classical histories, but they stressed that there were shared values between the two. While the ports along the coast of China and Vietnam were receiving teachers of Buddhism, it was Guangzhou that became the major portal for southern China, and all major shipping took place from it. Upstream on the Pearl River, Guangzhou was located miles from the open sea, but functioned as a contact point for the large hinterland that surrounded it and extended further inland along waterways. It was only in Guangzhou that the government had set up an official office to oversee the arrival of large cargoes into the nation. It was not until 1087 that a second entry point was opened in Quanzhou. Because Guangzhou was the single official portal for maritime trade, it thrived from the sizable international trade. Monasteries were constructed within the city, funded by the wealth that was accumulated from the large and growing maritime commerce that flowed all the way from the Indian Ocean through Southeast Asia to China. Maritime Buddhism, represented by monks and nuns, arrived in Guangzhou and moved from there into the heartland of the Han people. Early Buddhism, Mahayana, and Tantra were represented in the arrival of meditation masters such as Bodhidharma, or consciousness-only teachings of Yogacara, or tantric rituals of power, especially for the rulers, ordination of Chinese women as fully ordained nuns, and the ascendancy of Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva and his perceived manifestation as Guanyin, a feminine deity known for protection of those who sail the open seas. When one looks at contemporary Chinese Buddhism, it is soon obvious that the roots of it are to be found in those aspects of the tradition that made their way through Guangzhou. That is, the dominant influence from the maritime Buddhist world is still present. With the near closure of the caravan routes through Inner Asia, the expansion of maritime commerce was a dominant influence for the spread of Buddhism that extended to Guangzhou and later Quanzhou and Hongzhou. From these ports, we have records of pilgrimage travels, as well as active commercial ties to Japan and Korea. Often, the importance of the southern Chinese ports is omitted in the histories of Buddhism, as it made its way into the Korean peninsula and to the island kingdom of Japan. The contacts between Japan and Chunzhou resulted in the support for construction of Buddhist monasteries in the islands. This pattern is in many ways a description of the end point of maritime Buddhism. From the shores of India through Southeast Asia and the ports of East Asia, early support from the maritime merchants was essential for the rise and success of Buddhism. The role of maritime was lessened as Buddhism became localized in East Asia, with no further extensions of trade routes into the Pacific. Now, a word needs to be said about the Grand Canal. It was one way of having a waterway that was not the sea nor a river. It was a commercial route of importance, a man-made alternative to the seacoast shipping. The role of Buddhism and the merchants of the Grand Canal has yet to be written. However, Thomas Hahn has pointed out that Koreans played the role of translators for the Japanese and Chinese merchants who used the waterway. Just as the maritime merchants had given support to Buddhism, so too did those who traversed the canal. These Korean merchant translators constructed Buddhist temples all along the route. During the Cultural Revolution, most of them were destroyed, so we've lost evidence of their number, size, and importance. But this form of Buddhism along the Grand Canal can with some assurance be considered an extension of maritime trade into the hinterland. It does not mimic the riverine culture exactly, and future studies might well consider it as a separate form of travel and communication from our early formulations of sea, river, and road types of commerce. This final lecture of the course does not give space to deal in great detail with East Asian Buddhism and the impact of the maritime influences. It has been noted for some time that our study of Chinese Buddhism in Europe and North America was in the 20th century mainly in the hands of Japanese scholars. They continued a long-held method of scholarly research focused on the schools of Chinese Buddhism, their origins, their founders, texts, and monastic centers. These schools were seen as the roots of the sectarian divisions of Japan, such as Zen, Tendai, Pure Land, Shinshu, Tantra, Shingon. As we work with the arrival of Buddhism in the southern ports of China, using the template of distinct schools of Buddhism to describe this religious and cultural heritage is hardly possible or defensible. In the Maritime Buddhism study, we are witnessing a wide variety of systems of thought and practice that were not easily observable. We can take the examples of Chan or dhyana meditation practices that arrived in China over centuries of time. Buddhabhadra in the 3rd century and Bodhidharma in the 6th represented no single organized transmission from a central point in time or place for a Chan school. These masters arrived with a background of training from different places and different times. China was receiving through the ports of Guangzhou and Quanzhou a stream of teachers who represented a complex and interconnected system of practices and thoughts that can hardly be reduced to a few schools. For example, Tantra, as rituals of empowerment, was finding support from the royal houses and was less involved with the general population. Another active discourse in text and teachings, brought by a number of learned monks, introduced the issue of how reality is to be perceived and what role human consciousness plays in constructing the perceptions. These incoming approaches challenged the East Asian community to find some structure to describe and promote such complex factors. If we see this as systemic rather than defined entities, it gives us the ability to accept multiple sources coming from different times, representing changing views and interpretations. For example, the Chan tradition, which is considered the dominant form of monastic life in China today, was formed from the interplay of teachings by so-called Chan masters, starting with Buddhabhadra, intermixed with the debate over the nature of mind and perception, including the rituals and practices associated with Pure Land beliefs, and even chanting the Dharani sounds of Tantra. This systemic mixture is quite different from the one that developed in Japan. Instead of a multifaceted approach, Japanese Buddhists took the various elements of the Chinese system and made sectarian organizations out of them. Chan became Zen and Tantra Shingon. One had to choose which one to follow. And then a very different social underpinning developed, whereby celibacy for monastics was no longer enforced, and temples became hereditary properties of the priests. Korea presents a different history in which Buddhism was pitted against Confucianism. As a result, the monastic groups were put into marginal positions, restricted from even entering the cities, and relegated to mountain pilgrimage sites. So East Asian Buddhism was not a single tradition. In order to deal with the magnitude of the different strands of tradition that came together in southern China, a wider view of social, cultural, commercial, and governance aspects keeps us from simply reducing the mix to centrally controlled institutions. It is much like our earlier discussions of the problem of seeing empires mapped. It is much like our earlier discussions of the problem of seeing empires mapped, when perhaps the real situation was multiple political mandalas. Now, we have seen how Maritime Buddhism was directly tied to the rise and fall of merchant communities. So this gives us one way to define Maritime Buddhism. It was when the tradition not only moved about on trading ships, it was dependent on the support of the merchants who gained wealth from this type of trading. Buddhist supporters have been varied in background throughout history. Local and national leaders provided funds for monasteries, shrines, and rituals. During the span of more than 1,000 years, maritime traders were generous donors. Their support depended on the profits to be accumulated from commercial activities. Maritime trade offered the possibility of enormous returns. Ships were loaded with tons of cargo, and their markets for these goods were spread from one end of Eurasia to the other. Success was not guaranteed, since storms and pirates and shifting political structures could spell losses as impressive as the gains. Well, as profitable as the trade could be, it was often marginalized by government decree, or it lost markets due to political, social, and changes in the natural environment. Once maritime-supported Buddhism had reached the shores of China, with offshoots to Japan and Korea, it faced changes that would remove the possibility of having steady and significant funding from sea merchants. A great blow to the continued spread and prosperity of Buddhism through the maritime trading community came when Hongwu, founder of the Ming Dynasty, ceased to give support to maritime trade. The Korean Chosun court also turned away from external trade and encounters. Japan maintained contact with China not only through mercantile groups, but with a steady flow of pilgrims who made their way to the monasteries held to be the original homes for their sectarian practices. However, the losses associated with the Chinese markets greatly reduced the income and power of merchants who were donors to Buddhism. Another blow to the maritime trade were the violent and often deadly attacks being made by locals on foreign merchants in Guangzhou and Quanzhou ports. When the Portuguese arrived, they established a separate entry port at Macau, and this further degraded the international commerce that had been significant for the spread of maritime Buddhism. The dynamic nature of interaction of trade and travel for East Asia faded during the 14th and 15th centuries. And the era of maritime Buddhism for all practical purposes ended. In the following centuries, Islam and Christian merchants and colonizers would continue the practice of religion and mercantile developments. East Asia was a terminus for such trade. It was not until the Spanish established regular sailings between Manila and Acapulco in Mexico that maritime merchants once again provided major support for religious expansion, and the extension of maritime routes across the North Pacific carried spices from India, especially cinnamon. but it was under the religious control of Catholicism, not Buddhism. So we come to the end of our course with so much more to be said and researched. While Maritime Buddhist history covered centuries of time and touched on many hundreds of locations, it did not survive the shift in the mercantile community from Indian and Buddhist merchants to West Asian and Gujarat ones bringing Islam. The lack of support for maritime trade in East Asia meant that the focus of Buddhist support shifted to local groups with more limited spatial outreach. I still find maritime Buddhist history and influence to be of great importance for a full understanding of the history and the culture of South, Southeast, and East Asia. So let's hope that the future will bring all of this into a better perspective. And our research will give us a greater understanding of how mariners once helped to make Buddhism a world religion. Thank you for being part of the course.